Hey everyone, today we're talking about the Cold War and the Korean War. So when we're talking about the Cold War, it's mostly going to be just a list of terminologies and ideas that are going to help the Cold War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War make sense as we go on through the rest of the semester. If any of these terms don't make sense, please feel free to ask a question in that question discussion board that we've set up. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. When we discuss the Korean War here, we're going to keep it just really brief. The reason for that is that the Korean War and the Vietnam War are both on test 3, and I don't want anyone to get confused. So the Vietnam War is really the more important of the two, and so with the Korean War, we're just going to kind of hit the highlights. Alright, so starting with the Cold War. The Cold War begins in 1945, shortly after the close of World War II. We have a system now in place that's called a bipolar system. So basically what that means is the United States is one pole and Russia is the other pole. And if you think of this like metal shavings and having two magnets, the United States and Russia are pulling all of these other countries to their sides. In this map, what you're seeing is who is allied with who. So NATO is our main source of allies. There's going to be the very dark blue, light blue are other democracies that are allied with our version of democratic capitalism. And then on the other side, you see Russia and their allies. Very early in the Cold War, we developed this idea called containment. We have this theory that communism will die out if it is contained. If communism cannot spread, it will eventually die out. This theory actually turns out to be a valid one. Containment does help to reduce communism. The problem with containment is that it takes a lot longer than we thought it would. So we thought if we contained communism, it would die out within maybe a decade, and it turns out that when we contained communism, it died out in the 90s. So it took a lot more time than we thought it was going to. The next theory is not a valid theory. So the next theory is the domino theory. The domino theory states that if one country falls to communism, then the countries around it will fall to communism. The countries geographically located around it will fall. This is not true. So the biggest and easiest example of this is Cuba. Cuba falls to communism. The closest thing to Cuba is Florida. Florida doesn't fall to communism. So the domino theory is not valid. But it's going to be a really important part of how we conduct our foreign policy for the next 40 or so years. In the 1950s, the United States is going to successfully create a hydrogen bomb, which is 17 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And then right on our heels, the Soviet Union is also going to have access to that kind of a weapon. And so we entered this era of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. So if we bomb the Soviet Union, they will bomb us. At the height of the Cold War, we have missiles about 17 minutes from Moscow. So if we hit the red button, Moscow will be blown up within 17 minutes. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union can blow up Washington, D.C. in about 15 minutes. So if we find out they've pushed the button, we're going to push our button, and both countries will be destroyed. Mutually assured destruction. This is a theory that is supposed to prevent us from entering into World War III. If we enter into World War III, it will be the end of civilization. So we should try everything in our power not to do that. We're also going to see our politicians come up with some different doctrines that help guide our foreign policy. So the first one we need to talk about is the Truman Doctrine. So obviously named for President Truman, this is his foreign policy while he is president. This is a shift from previous foreign policy, but it's also our first Cold War president. So to some extent, he's really starting from scratch here. So the first part of the Truman Doctrine says that the United States is going to offer assistance to any country that is threatened by communism. So assistance can mean we're going to give them money, it can mean war supplies, or it can mean that we're going to send troops. The first country that we end up assisting is going to be Greece. We have two factions that are fighting in Greece. One is a communist faction, one is a democratic faction, and we end up spending $56 million there to help the democratic faction. That's a lot of money on a country that really doesn't matter that much to our foreign policy. But the last part of the Truman Doctrine says that the United States' own interests will not be considered. So this was meant to be as an altruistic form of foreign policy. No matter if your country is important to us or not, no matter if you have oil or not, no matter if you are a strategic location or not, we're going to come help you. The problem ends up being that we spend a lot of money in countries that don't really matter all that much to us. And then later, we sent a lot of American troops to countries that don't really matter all that much to us. So in the years since the Truman Doctrine, that's been a really easy way to criticize it. Because we should have put some of our own interests in place before helping these other countries. Another really important part of our Cold War foreign policy is going to be the Marshall Plan. So the official name of this is actually the Economic Cooperation Act of 1948, but you're almost never going to hear it called that. Most people just refer to it as the Marshall Plan. This is something like a New Deal for Europe. So most of Europe has been devastated by war, World War II. So nations would create a plan for an economic reconstruction that they needed. So let's say there's a village in France that needs to have a bridge rebuilt so that they can get goods into their village that they can sell what they're producing. The United States does not build that bridge for them. What they do is they would provide money to hire a local team to build the bridge. So in the same way that the New Deal was all about getting a job, this is about getting people in Europe jobs to fix their own infrastructure. We're bankrolling it, we're funding it, but we're not doing the actual building. So since the end of the Marshall Plan, what we can see is that this stabilized European currency, it promoted production, and that the money was generally well spent. There's very little fraud here. Theoretically, the Marshall Plan funds are open to any country devastated by war. The Soviet Union has been devastated by war. So they actually apply for some money from the Marshall Plan. They're not going to get anything. Because while part of the Marshall Plan is altruistic, we want to help Europe, we want to rebuild, the other part of the Marshall Plan is that we are trying to sway countries away from communism. We created this fund so that they would be more closely tied to us than they would be tied to the Soviet Union. Whichever country feeds you, that's the country you're going to have loyalty to. So the Marshall Plan, yes, it's about rebuilding Europe, but it's also about really firming up our allies in Europe so that they can resist communism and they will stay allied with us. The first major confrontation in the Cold War is going to be the Korean War. So we do have two sides here. We have the democracies, which are going to be the United States, the Republic of Korea, which just to be easy, we're going to call South Korea, and the United Nations. For the communist-backed countries, we have the Soviet Union, which is the USSR. We have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and we have the People's Republic of China. Anytime you see Democratic People's Republic or People's Republic, that's your clue that those are communist countries. I know that that sounds like a democracy, but anytime you hear People's Republic, that's a communist country. So the issues in Korea really start before 1950. In World War II, Japan had invaded Korea, and Japan gets as far into Korea as the 38th parallel. When the war is over, the United States and the Soviet Union are dividing up land, and so they decide to divide Korea in half on the 38th parallel. That is what we call an artificial border. There's not a language difference, there's not a cultural difference, there's not a racial difference between North and South Korean people, there's not a mountain, there's not a river, there's no geographic barrier there. So it really is just a line on a map. The North is told that they're going to be communist, the South is told they're going to be democratic. 4 years later, in 1949, China falls to communism. So now North Korea is going to really cement that relationship to China. They are both communist countries, but both Korean countries want reunification. The North wants all of Korea to be one country and to be communist. The South wants Korea to be all one country and to be democratic. There's a lot of tension between both sides. Then in June of 1950, North Korea crosses the 38th parallel and attacks South Korea. So North Korea is the aggressive party. South Korea is going to ask the United Nations for help, and this is the first time the UN sends troops into a dispute. One of the largest suppliers of troops to the UN is going to be the United States, and so when we're entering this conflict, Truman is going to make use of both the Truman Doctrine, Containment, and the Domino theory to explain why we need to go into this conflict, and he's also going to issue a promise. Truman's going to make a promise to the American people and to the UN that he never intends to drop another nuclear weapon. So Truman's the president that dropped 2 atomic bombs in Japan. By this point, we've seen the pictures, we know what that devastation was like, and Truman never wants to do that again. So Truman says that those weapons are illegitimate weapons of war. We will never use them again. That is in direct conflict with a lot of men in our military. General MacArthur is going to make the point that the quickest way to end this war is the use of nuclear weapons. And he's going to get replaced because he refuses to go along with that order that we should not even consider nuclear weapons. Because he continues to advocate that point, and because he talks to the press a lot about that point, Truman's going to relieve him of duty. So he's going to be removed from Korea. That's going to show how committed Truman is to that promise. He never intends for us to use another nuclear weapon. So like I said before, the Korean War and the Vietnam War are both on test 3. So I don't want to really go too deep into the Korean War. I want to just sort of hit the highlights with you. So in June of 1950, the war begins. And at first, North Korea does very, very well. In October of 1950, China joins the war. At first, that was a little bit of a secret that China had joined the war, but it very quickly becomes apparent just from the number of troops that North Korea had. There was no way that North Korea on their own had that many troops. So very obvious very quickly that China's part of this war. In April of 1951, MacArthur is relieved of duty. By the end of 1950 and going into 1951, the Americans have turned things around. They are doing pretty well in the war. They've advanced into the north. They've actually been holding territory in the north. And then in April of 1951, MacArthur is relieved of duty. This is where Truman removes him because he keeps talking about nuclear weapons. In July, we begin peace talks, but those talks are going to fall apart along the issue of POWs. Part of the Geneva Conventions say that if you capture a prisoner of war, POW, you cannot force them to return to their home country. We had captured lots of North Korean and Chinese soldiers. They find out that we cannot force them to go back to their home countries. So they think if they just refuse for long enough, they will get to come to the United States. When we enter peace talks, North Korea wants to do a one-for-one exchange of soldiers. We can't do that because these soldiers refuse to go to their home countries. So those talks break down. In 1952, we have a presidential election that's happening in the background of this. We're also going to launch a massive bombing campaign in the North in October. And then after the conclusion of our presidential election, and once Eisenhower becomes president, those peace talks are going to resume again. So I want to talk to you guys about what happened in 1952 that made North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union decide that maybe we should enter peace talks. The first thing is, in 1952, the United States successfully launched a hydrogen bomb. The United States is going to launch a bomb that is 17 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And at this point, that really is a very, very scary weapon. The second thing that happens is that Dwight Eisenhower becomes president. Dwight Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. This is the man that we most credit with having defeated Hitler. And now he is going to be a wartime president during the Korean War. When Eisenhower becomes president-elect, so he's been elected, but he hasn't been sworn in yet, he is going to take a trip to Korea. Now, as Americans, we really don't like this. We don't like our newly elected but not yet sworn in president going to Korea and taking a tour. We're very concerned that something could happen to him. He could be killed there. And his vice president at this point is Nixon. So we really, really don't like that. But while Eisenhower is in Korea, he's going to give a series of speeches on various military bases. And in those speeches, he says that the promise not to use an atomic bomb ends when Truman leaves office. Eisenhower says that as far as he is concerned, those are legitimate weapons of war, and he plans to use one if he has to. So in January of 1953, Eisenhower is sworn in. He's already said he intends to use a nuclear bomb if he needs to. And then we're going to see North Korea want to enter into negotiations. This is something of a trick question, but there is no treaty that ends the Korean War. We never got far enough into the agreement to actually sign a treaty. So instead, what we have in Korea is an armistice. We have an agreement to end hostility, but technically the war is ongoing. The armistice agreement reverts to the 38th parallel as the demarcation line, and on 2.5 miles on either side, there's a demilitarized zone. So if you're in the demilitarized zone, there's no really good reason for you to be there. You will probably be shot. We also are going to create a process for those POWs, which is how we finally get to the end of this agreement, but it doesn't formally end the war. So technically, we are still in a state of hostility with North Korea. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War because it comes sandwiched in between World War II and the Vietnam War. And it's a war that we were only in for about 3 years, but it's a very costly war. So first I want to talk about the political cost of the war. One of the most important things is that for a lot of people, the Korean War was proof that both containment and the domino theory were valid. We are able to contain communism in North Korea, and therefore the dominoes didn't fall. So if we can do it in North Korea, the logic is going to state that we can do it in Vietnam. We can do it in Cambodia. So that's a really dangerous precedent that we're setting up. The second really big issue here as far as political costs go is that we spent $67 billion on just 3 years of war. That's a very costly war. And it's coming in a time when we're starting to see our economy slow down after the boom of World War II. As far as casualties in this war, we have 33,000 Americans that die in this war. In Vietnam, we have 50,000 Americans that die, but in Vietnam, we're there for 20 years. So day by day, the Korean War is actually the more deadly of the two. More people died per day in Korea than they do on average in Vietnam. We're going to have almost 8,000 that are missing in action, and that carries on to this day. As remains are found, they are returned to their families whenever possible. But our casualty numbers even look really small compared to what Korea and China face. In South Korea, we have over 200,000 military deaths, but more significantly, over 1 million civilian deaths. And that's because their country is the one that was being invaded and the one that was being occupied. In North Korea, we have 400,000 military deaths and about 600,000 civilian deaths. And for China, about 600,000 military deaths. So again, a very, very bloody war in a very short amount of time. So for the Korean War, if you can answer those questions that are in the video description, you're good. That's really all you need to know. Because again, the more important of the two is going to be Vietnam, and we're going to go in much greater detail in the Vietnam War.